Welcome to the Spiritual Geek Podcast, Wisdom for Modern Times, where we focus on living with intention to consciously create a life you love and celebrate. I'm your host, Sheila Franzen, and I'm so excited to share another episode with you. Today, Jill Baumgartner has joined me for a discussion about mental health and therapy and all things related to this transformation of personal development and self-growth. Jill is a licensed psychotherapist in private practice. She blends traditional talk therapy with practices that honor the wisdom of the body and the intuitive guidance of emotions. Jill is passionate about helping others embrace inner healing, integrating trauma, and returning to wholeness through the path of the heart. Jill, welcome, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. It's a topic that is talked about so much more these days. Is there anything else you would like to share as part of your own introduction before we get started or as we get started here?
Sure. Well, it's a great introduction. One thing that came to me recently, I think that, I'm super passionate about the work that I do, but I feel very fortunate in that I've known since I was a teenager that I wanted to be a therapist. And I think regardless of any life experiences I had had up until that point, they were really like kind of a small percentage of why I wanted to do it. It was more just this really deeply soulful path that I knew that I wanted to help people and to serve. And then, kind of the steps are laid out of like, well, how do you do that? But I was thinking recently, I had this very, when I see clients, sometimes they're kind of struggling with their purpose and they might be in a job that they're just not feeling fulfilled. And so I have just this very deep empathy um, for helping people, along their path, if that's part of their journey of, finding what they want to do.
Mm. Yeah, that's a tough one. I spent a lot of years trying to figure out my passion and my purpose. Sometimes that question in and of itself can be really frustrating when you feel like you can't get clarity around that. So you, in this concept of, even in your intro, you mentioned blending talk therapy with practices that honor the wisdom of the body and the guidance of emotions. And I know from my own experience with therapy, which I'll, jump to a little bit later. So how would you describe therapy today, or how do you describe it for you and what you're doing compared to, I've had my share of conversations with people resistant to the concept of therapy, even, right? Of like, I don't need help. I don't want help. This isn't valuable for me. Why would I go talk to a stranger? All of those kind of things that go around this concept of, really being able to engage with somebody to help you to work through with something. How do you blend all those things to make it make sense for people these days?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it might be helpful too if I share a little bit of an overview. I think what I've seen over the last couple of years is just a shift in more people being open to therapy, which is really awesome. I think it just kind of normalizes that it's okay to talk to someone, and having support on the path of self growth. So um, I I see people sometimes people come to therapy for different reasons, right? There might be like an event that happened or more chronic symptoms or just kind of a curiosity. They want to communicate better with their partner or set more healthy boundaries. But I see kind of a whole gamut of awareness and insight. So sometimes someone will come to me and I'll be like, wow, that sounds like anxiety. And they might not know that it's anxiety.
Mm.
Or I think sometimes these things we don't see mental health symptoms. Like if you break a bone, it gets set in a cast for weeks and you kind of know, you know what I mean? It's visible, but I think sometimes it's the invisible wounds that we have that it's good to be open to kind of processing through them and having that support to do that. So One thing that I see a lot too, and I always ask this when I'm first meeting with someone, is just very basic questions of like, how's your sleep? How's your appetite? And the amount of times that I've heard that people aren't sleeping well is really pretty high. And that I think kind of brings the awareness back to just the body. Like, we should be sleeping. That's our body's way of, clearing out toxins. And when our eyes move back and forth at night, like it's helping us process the day and hold on to memories that we need to hold on to and information that we need and things that we don't need. So sometimes that just is a good answer to a question that I ask. It helps me kind of guide the framework of some work that we can do. So to answer your question too about just my practice, I think something several years ago that really changed my practice. I was kind of starting out in the profession. I go to school, then you get licensed and doing all these hours and working with people. And you can read something in a book, but until you actually like work with someone, that's where like the real learning and growth comes into play. But I remember there was a time where I offered a coping skill to a teenager, and I just had this own curiosity. I was like, that's not going to work for this kid. And I was like, why isn't it going to work? And so I started to just kind of question, like, yes, I could give them a worksheet and there's this information on there that's very valuable. But if they're emotionally dysregulated, there needs to be a step before that, before they can even look at the worksheet.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. And so
Yeah.
that I kind of went into this deep dive of learning more about trauma and the nervous system in both brain hemispheres and how those like really impact us. And sometimes we need skills for those parts of our body to be able to do deep, insightful work.
Yeah, I love what you're bringing in of kind of the invisible things, right? And there's an aspect of, I do a lot and spend a lot of time talking with energy healers and coaches, but I love the twist of this concept of thinking about therapy as an aspect of that inner knowing, right? It's that inner map. What's going on inside of our inside, right? Like healing a bone, there's a structured process for that in the medical world. And I think that's such a beautiful example to say, well, if if there's things that aren't feeling right in my life, whether it's sleep or anxiety, or even if it's just like I look at life and say, if you're not happy, find a path, right? Find somebody that can launch you into a direction that lets you experience more joy in life. Because why not try to have a goal of just like, let's have more fun in life?
Sure.
And I think that, this ability to dig in and have questions and, just really appreciate the power and the benefits of a therapeutic process. I mean, that makes it sound almost very medical, but to me, like I've discovered a therapy in college from a perspective of really struggling in my own college life and, the counselor on campus, and finally just surrendered to going in because I needed somebody to talk to. Like there were things I could not make sense out of and I needed support. And it really was a journey that it was the beginning, I think, of the introspective. Like I was always a quiet introvert, but the true introspective process that happens with therapy um, was the launch of personal development in its own way for me. And I ended up finding a therapist in my 20s after an extremely difficult time of life where I just I couldn't get traction. I couldn't make sense out of it. I was just miserable mentally. And that therapist, I mean, I worked with that therapist off and on for 10 years. There was a period of time for several years that I did full psychoanalytic therapy in the depth of, actually going in and doing talk therapy 4 days a week. And the depth at which I got to know myself, my own thoughts, how my sleep was working, where I had anxiety, all of that stuff was an incredible gift in my journey to really investigate and understand, and a lot of tools that gave me the perspective of there is this whole inner world. And I think it's like, oh, well, that, I watched this with my children. There's, as teenagers, there is, conversation that happens that is all about the labels that people have. It's like everybody's wanting to label, these internal things of emotions and anxiety and panic disorder and this and that. And it's like they all get labels, but nobody really knows how to work with them, right? How do you move through them? How do you deal with trauma? So the idea of the inner map and the inner journey is just so important because it's what keeps us from our joy. It's what keeps us from finding peace and contentment with life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think something too that I wanted to touch on is just like my role as a clinician, right? It's like I'm holding space for someone and I'm guiding and doing these clinical interventions and just kind of always like triaging. But I think that just having someone to listen to you, right? What
Mhm.
that does is, I mean, we have mirror neurons. Like someone in their life may never have listened to them. And, there's wounds around feeling invalidated, and that can change structures in the brain. Um, but when we feel listened to, like someone gets our experience, we can create oxytocin, a bonding hormone. I mean, there's like chemical things that are happening in a therapeutic process. And I think sometimes, it's good to know that because then you can kind of buy into a little bit of like, okay, I'm here for myself and there's these changes that are happening and I might not be able to see them, but when I'm done talking, I feel better.
Yes, exactly. Like it really does make a difference. I love that you bring the geekiness of the science into it because we have a whole set of chemical reactions that happen with every thought, right? If you want to get really into it. And so
Sure.
when you're dealing with trauma and thought and, the neural pathways, there is real physical stuff going on, that and real physical healing that's happening just by engaging in this aspect of, being able to talk about something and being listened to, like the witness of being listened to. We acknowledge our own presence in that. Like it's a beautiful thing.
Yes, and I think it speaks to like having value, right? For someone to say like, yes, that I hear you and you went through that, and it helps people feel valued. I was just thinking too, just to give kind of like a Cliff Notes version here. There's something called it's referred to as top-down therapy, and then there's bottom-up therapy. So the
Mm.
top-down therapy is like what we would think of as like traditional therapy, where you're like verbally processing, and there is so much value to that. I pepper that into my practice all the time, especially during a session. But the bottom up is it's taking a look at like the limbic system and different areas of the brain. So that's where the body kind of comes into play of how we can integrate certain thoughts that we have and certain experiences to integrate these parts of us to, reclaim our wholeness. So there are a lot of interventions that I've learned over the years that I would do with clients where just helping them become aware of their body, identifying feelings, um, noticing just sort of nuances of where they might even look when they're having a feeling. They can practice those things outside of session. Then if they're, having a disagreement with their partner or their spouse, they would then have this inner awareness of, oh, maybe I'm feeling guilty, or I put my head down when I feel guilty, right? So there's our body's constantly giving us clues. Sometimes we just need the skills to be able to kind of tap into that awareness and also just be curious about it. Because when we're curious about something, it's like a mindfulness skill where we're in the present moment.
Yes, curiousness. I love that. It's the asking, well, what's going on right now? Why am I feeling this way?
Sure.
Have I done this before? And how have I responded this way in the past? Or how could I respond differently? Right? Curious. I love the energy of curiosity because it keeps us in a place of innocence if we think back to being a child and our innocence of being curious about the world. And we lose that often through our journeys of life where through whatever has transpired. But it is curiosity is what can bring us back to wholeness and understanding and releasing and all of those pieces of it. But it's hard to do that on your own. I think that's the real power of like I can still remember so many times the therapist I worked with so many years ago would ask me a question and I'd be like, I never thought of it that way, or I've never
Sure.
considered that. And so that aspect of no matter how well we know ourselves, the witness of somebody that goes, oh, but what about this? Or have you considered this? Or how's that? How are you experiencing that? It's just invaluable. It's a really beneficial process to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just even challenging certain thoughts that we might have or shifting. I kind of use the metaphor of like looking through a kaleidoscope. If you just shift it a little bit, there's a whole different picture and different structures that you see. And so sometimes we just need like a shift in our awareness and then we feel different, which can be really invaluable. And that's part of like challenging thoughts is part of that top down approach. Like it has value. Um, the bottom up approach is just kind of also honoring like the nuances of the nervous system and everyone, their experiences are different. So with trauma, for instance, it's not necessarily like what happens, it's how that event or that experience gets stored in the body. And so someone might have, an emotional reaction where they become really upset, whereas somebody else might shut down. And so
Mhm.
understanding those responses can be like a huge part of someone's growth in just kind of normalizing their experience where I say, hey, here is a worksheet. This is written on there. This happens to other people too. And so they know they're not alone in that. Or I might say, yes, this is, there's a book about this. Right. And so sometimes we just need to know that this information is out there because it happens to other people as well, and so you don't feel as alone in your experience. Sometimes, I mean, in my practice I see a lot of people feeling like isolated with their feelings, and shame is a big one. So sometimes we have certain beliefs that keep us in shame, and shame is, you know it's a feeling, but I would say it's like a denser kind of lower vibration feeling, and so it's we have to feel all of our feelings, but we don't want to stay stuck in that one. So we kind of acknowledge it, but be able to shift out of it.
Yeah, the bottom up and the top down is, um, well, that's where wholeness is at, right? That's the
Mhm.
aspect of seeing wholeness. If we only come at it from one way and ignore the other, then the other is ignored. But if you leverage both of that, what you describe with the bottom up, the body and the limbic system and the nervous system, and the top down of our mind and our thoughts and creating our reality, then you are looking at wholeness. And I think that is
Sure.
um, that's a much more complete approach to therapy than someone who might approach therapy from only one of those perspectives. That makes it feel more complete versus just saying, oh, it's talk therapy.
Sure. I'm so glad we're talking about this because I was just thinking of something else. I work a lot with the right and the left side of the brain as well, and so what it's referred to as like being whole brain. So we're talking about wholeness.
Mhm.
So this plays into that as well. But we kind of operate best when both sides of our brain are balanced, and depending on, we might have preferences or habits or certain life experiences or even trauma sometimes where we rely on one side more than the other. And so sometimes I offer just these educational like tidbits is what I would describe them as to clients where, the left side is, we have an area on the left side of the brain called the Broca's area, which is all about language. So left and language, but it's like order and being practical. And we need that to kind of function in the day to day. The right side is all about like being in the present and emotion and being expressive, creative. And oftentimes in my practice, if I can kind of see someone might be relying on one more than the other, I'll purposefully ask them something to get them in the other side of the brain. And so what that's doing is it's helping neuroplasticity, right? So it's getting the right and the left side of the brain to connect with one another. And as they're doing that, they're able to become more aware of emotions, but it's also just bringing balance to the brain as a whole. So we have this, I kind of think of it as like a highway that goes down the middle of the brain called the corpus callosum. And so that's sort of going down, but that can become strengthened. And with these certain exercises, or just being curious about, well, I don't want to over intellectualize, maybe I'm having a feeling, or, kind of going back and forth. I have found that to be really beneficial with clients over the years. And I actually have a little, like a structure of a brain that I painted. And so I use that as like a demo just to show them, because sometimes the visual cues are helpful where someone can see like, oh, okay, this side is very colorful and the left side I painted is just kind of more, almost looks like computerized. But we need, again, it's about integration, right? We need both sides to be able to communicate with one another so that we are our best selves.
Yeah. And everything I know about trauma and the mind and thoughts and emotions, when you talk about the two halves of the brain, it's even just purely, we could go down a whole path of uh, actually food you eat and health and how that affects actually can affect the two sides of the brain and that channel that lies in between the two halves of the brain. But like what pops into my mind, like I know over the years I've learned different exercises. I actually have one that I do every morning that's actually about activating both sides of the brain. It's like a cross body crawl that I learned through Donna Eden's daily energy practice. Is there some, like, what's your favorite technique or super simple technique to like bring a body back into balance, or the brain? Is there one that you love to do?
Oh, sure. So if I'm working with someone, there's certain questions that I might ask. So let's say someone, if I kind of observe them to be in the left brain where they might be, maybe like we have a defense mechanism, sometimes we might intellectualize about things, but to get them into the right brain, I might ask like, well, is there a color to describe maybe what you're feeling? Because sometimes people struggle with accessing feelings, and that's okay. It's like kind of learning, we need to learn the ABCs before we write in cursive, right? So, but you can do it, build these skills in other ways. So a color, a texture, a shape. And so all that's doing is activating the right side, where it's just kind of getting, it's almost like the brain's getting a little cardio. So now the right side is like a little activated, right? Something, if I sometimes people can get, emotionally dysregulated. And so that would be more the right side of the brain. So I might purposefully ask them a question to get into the left side. So, I mean, something as simple as like, I've asked people like, what color are your shoes? Or just notice your feet inside of your shoes, or just bringing their awareness back to the present can help to activate the left side and maybe take a little bit off of the intensity of the emotion that they were experiencing. And their brain is kind of rewiring as they're doing that. So that back and forth is what can be really helpful.
I just love that you talk about rewiring the brain and these simple little tricks, because they're tricks that we can practice ourselves, and they're
Sure.
tricks that sometimes you can't even identify yourself, which again comes back to our benefit of getting support. Like I think about when I'm super analytical, or there's times where then it's like I will actually pull out, like if I just need to get my brain offline, I actually pull out like the adult coloring books that I have and I just color because I'm like,
Yeah.
I need to do something that's creative, right? Something that's so different than where my brain is literally stuck in thinking mode, so to speak. And then I'm reminded of also, like when I feel really angry or frustrated, one of the things that I do is and my kids know this about me, that's really funny is they'll actually tell me, "Oh, are you," because I'll start organizing something because the act of organizing actually like for me brings structure back to my thought process instead
Yes.
of the emotion that I'm stuck in. And so if I'm organizing or cleaning a room, now my kids are like, "Are you angry? Were you angry?"
Sure.
I'm like, "No, I'm not." But I could have been, and that is what I do to get myself out of frustration because, like, it's the fastest way I've found that shifts the energy because it literally is rewiring those. I mean, I can sit and meditate and I can do release and forgiveness and all that, but the movement in the physical world brings the emotions back into balance for me.
Absolutely. And I think, sometimes I'll even ask like someone to, can you define like what is an emotion? Like what are these? Because sometimes people have fear around them as well based on certain experiences um and emotions are just energy. And I think sometimes when people know that or understand that, it become like, oh, okay, well, everything's energy, right? And so sometimes we just need help, and like a nudge or whatever that support is, to be able to say like, okay, I'm dealing with something, but this is just energy that needs expressed through my body, whether I go out and run or I journal, um whatever we need in that moment is usually, but sometimes people need help figuring out what that is. So
Right. I mean, it's only after, oh, how many years now? 25 years of asking myself internal questions and curiosity that I can generally get myself out of, one thought process or one emotional process. But that's come with a ton of practice, and that originated, like I really, knowing our conversation was coming up today, like thinking back, that's originated from that aspect of a therapeutic process that I engaged in for years to really deepen the inner knowing of my own experience of life.
sure. Yeah, I was just thinking too, uh, as far as like, so something as simple as like a coping skill as journaling, right? It's a great coping skill. It helps us process our feelings. It's can help us, categorize things. It's what I refer to as like one pointed focus, right? So when we're writing, it's like a very mindful activity. But this is something that years ago that kind of shifted my practice. Like if I'm sitting there trying to give a teenager a coping skill and they're upset, they're not going to want to journal. Their brain is actually going to find it difficult to do that. So that's where, in my own experience, I was like, yeah, that wouldn't even work for me. Like, what am I missing here? So, it's finding these other skills that could be helpful to then be eventually be able to journal. And I think that sometimes people, if you can have that understanding, again, it brings like just this, it normalizes the therapy experience of like, okay, well that would be difficult if you were upset to sit down and journal. Maybe you need to go release some energy before you're able to sit down and do this introspective work. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, I love journaling, and that was another tool that I learned very on in the therapeutic process, and it's still a tool I use frequently to process things. But it is hard to jump to that, right? Like
Sure.
that makes complete sense. There's probably some other steps to take in that process of being able to dive into saying, "Oh, yeah, I'll just go journal and figure this out." It's not always that easy.
Yeah, sure.
Um, So one of the things, and I just kind of, maybe this is kind of a topic where we bring ourselves back to the aspect of energy and wholeness and the spiritual geekiness of this podcast, is you end your bio with a wholeness through the path of the heart. And I would just love to hear, you know, how does heart fit into this? What was your intention with that?
Hmm. Yeah, it just kind of, when I was writing it, just kind of came through me. I was like, wow, that's powerful. But I think that it's always, we have experiences, we have relationships, but it always kind of comes back to the self.
Hmm.
And I think we have certain experiences where we learn to either keep people at bay or we don't want to get hurt. But our heart, if it's open and expansive, that's where like true healing is. And sometimes we need just help working through to remember that.
Mm,
um I was just thinking to it in terms of like, you know how my role as a clinician might help people. If I see, sometimes it's like, can you quantify how someone's doing better, right? If they're doing something 4 out of 7 days a week and it goes down to two out of 7, they're like, oh, hey, that got better. But sometimes
mhm,
it can be hard to pinpoint. And I will often like reflect back, like, well, you're smiling more, or
mhm,
your posture changed, right? So all of those things, like something as simple as posture, if we aren't feeling well about ourselves or if we're feeling shameful, we tend to kind of like hunch over and protect our heart. And if we
mm,
feel positive or, healthy, what I refer to as like healthy pride, we sit up straight, our heart is open. And then how does that then impact how we interact with others in our relationships and the quality of just connecting with ourselves and others in our lives? It's just um, so important, I think. And sometimes we get disconnected from that. But I think the heart is um, way more healing than sometimes we even realize.
well, and I love how you bring it back to a reflection of kind of our relationship with our own heart. And, when we talk about connection, it is that aspect of, is our heart open or not, right? Like, we could probably do a whole episode on just relationships and connection.
Sure.
Um, I probably shouldn't dive down that path right now, but that is this journey of wholeness, right? Is we do come back into our bodies and we are more at peace with our minds and we're more content in our heart. And um and why not have somebody help us discover that, right? It's like if that's not how we feel in life, um then have that be a goal, right? Like it is possible, and be open to being supported in that journey.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as we complete our conversation here, how can people get started working with you? How can they find you, discover you?
Sure. That's a good question. So I'm based in San Diego. The best way to find me is probably my website, to be honest. I have a contact form on there if anyone is interested in getting in touch with me. My phone number is on there. And then I also have a tab for workshops. So if anyone is maybe not in, California or in the area, but they're interested in, any of these topics, they can sign up for like a mailing list on there as well. So
That's great. As you do, and so those workshops are online.
yeah, so Zoom options and in-person options as well. And so it's, they sign up there and I would send more information on what's becoming available. But it's a good avenue to get connected.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Jill, for joining me today. It has been fun to explore these different aspects of our personal journey and how a therapeutic process can accelerate that personal journey, right? Deepen it and enliven it. So thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was super fun. I have a lot of gratitude for being here and being able to just share information that I think is just so valuable.
Yeah, you're welcome. You've just listened to the Spiritual Geek Podcast. Thank you for joining us. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to share a comment and a rating on your favorite podcast platform. If you were inspired, consider sharing with friends and family. Love and light to each of you, and may your day be filled with joy and wisdom as you consciously create your life.